The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain from the night before. The city was still waking up, the streets quiet except for the occasional car rolling by. Zion Whitaker walked his usual route to school, the cracked sidewalks and faded storefronts passing by in a blur. It was a 15-minute walk, a routine so familiar that he barely noticed the world around him. His mind was elsewhere, bouncing between the history test he had stayed up late studying for and the debate competition coming up that Friday. He had been preparing for weeks, memorizing arguments, practicing counterpoints in the mirror. Winning meant everything. His backpack felt heavier than usual. Maybe it was the textbooks, or maybe it was just the exhaustion of another long night. Either way, he shifted the weight, adjusting the strap over his shoulder as he kept moving. Then, the sirens. Loud, sudden, and close. The sharp wail cut through the morning stillness, snapping him out of his thoughts. Up ahead, red and blue lights flashed against the glass windows of a small hardware store on the corner. Zion slowed his pace, his eyes flicking toward the scene. The store's front window was shattered, shards of glass scattered across the sidewalk, glinting in the dull light. A yellow police tape stretched across the entrance, fluttering slightly in the breeze. A police officer stood near the doorway, talking in hushed tones with the store owner. The man's face was tight with frustration, his arms crossed, his mouth moving fast as he gestured toward the damage. Zion couldn't hear what was being said, but he didn't need to. He had lived in this neighborhood his entire life. He had seen break-ins before, seen the way these situations played out. He adjusted his hoodie, tucked his hands into his pockets, and kept walking. This wasn't his problem. He was just trying to get to school. Then, a voice. Loud. Sharp. Hands where I can see them. Zion's body reacted before his mind could catch up. His heart kicked hard against his ribs, a spike of confusion rushing through him. For a split second, he thought maybe they were yelling at someone else. But then he saw him. Sergeant Roy Kincaid. The name was familiar, and not in a good way. Everyone in the neighborhood knew him, not for protecting, but for harassing. The kind of cop who saw trouble where there wasn't any. And right now, his eyes were locked on Zion. Zion barely had time to process before Kincaid started toward him, moving fast, his hand resting on his holster. His instinct screamed at him to run, but he knew better. He had seen what happened when people ran. His hand shot up, palms open, fingers spread wide, his breath catching in his throat. "What's going on?" he asked, forcing his voice to stay steady. It didn't matter that he had done nothing wrong. It didn't matter that he had never been in trouble before. It didn't even matter that he was just a kid walking to school. Because in Kincaid's eyes, he was already guilty. Zion didn't get an answer. Kincaid didn't explain. He didn't pause. He just grabbed Zion's wrist and yanked it behind his back, twisting it hard. Pain shot up Zion's arm, sharp and sudden. His other hand was wrenched back just as quickly, and before he could react, cold metal clamped around his wrists. The handcuffs bit into his skin, the steel pressing too tight against his bones. Zion sucked in a sharp breath. His heart slammed against his ribs. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice edged with panic. Kincaid didn't answer. Instead, he pressed the radio at his shoulder, speaking in a clipped, certain voice. "We got him." Zion's stomach dropped. "Got who?" His voice cracked as he tried to force the words out. "Got who?" Kincaid didn't hesitate. Security footage puts you near the store when it got hit. You match the description. Zion's mind raced. Security footage? He hadn't even been near the store. He had been walking past, heading to school like he did every morning. He struggled against the cuffs. "That's not true, I didn't." "Don't play dumb," Kincaid muttered, tightening his grip on Zion's arm, forcing him to stumble forward. Zion clenched his jaw, trying to keep his breathing steady. "The description," he said, trying to process. "What description?" Kincaid's voice was cold, flat, like he wasn't even talking to a person, just a suspect. Dark hoodie. Sneakers. Young. Black. There it was. Zion felt his chest tighten. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't proof. It was just him. A small crowd had started to gather. Cars slowed as people pulled out their phones, watching. But no one stepped forward. Zion swallowed hard. Someone had to say something. Someone had to stop this. But no one did. Kincaid shoved him toward the squad car. His legs felt heavy, his steps unsteady. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. But then the car door slammed shut behind him, and he knew. It was too late. His life would never be the same again. The squad car smelled like sweat and old leather, the scent thick in the enclosed space. Zion sat stiffly in the back seat, his hands still cuffed behind him, his wrists throbbing from where the metal had bitten into his skin. Every bump in the road made the cuffs dig in deeper, but he didn't complain. He kept his mouth shut, staring out the window, watching the familiar streets of his neighborhood blur past him. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. He wanted to yell, to demand they check the security footage, to tell them they had the wrong person. But deep down, he already knew the truth. They weren't interested in the truth. The ride was short, but it felt like a lifetime. When they pulled up to the police station, Zion barely had time to process before the door swung open. A rough hand grabbed his arm and yanked him out of the car. His backpack, the one filled with textbooks and notebooks, proof of the life he should be living today, was left behind in the squad car, forgotten. Inside, the station was cold. The kind of cold that didn't just settle on your skin, it seeped into your bones. They took his name first. Then his fingerprints. Then, without a word, they made him take off his shoelaces, as if he were some criminal about to throw his life away. Zion stood still, jaw clenched, doing everything he could to keep his face blank. But inside, his chest was tight, his breath shallow. A cop with tired eyes, not Kincaid, but another officer who looked like this was just another routine booking, finally spoke. "Your mom's been called," he said flatly, barely looking up from the paperwork in front of him. Zion's stomach twisted. Lorraine Whitaker. The hardest working woman he knew. A single mother who never missed a shift, never made excuses, never backed down from anything. The one person Zion never wanted to see worried. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Then another. And then, the heavy door swung open, and Lorraine stormed in like a hurricane. Her coat was half-buttoned, her hair still pulled back from her shift, but her eyes were fire, burning with an anger so sharp it cut through the entire room. The moment she saw Zion, her gaze locked onto his, scanning him, checking for any sign of harm. Relief flashed in her eyes for half a second before it was swallowed by fury. Then she turned to the officers, her voice sharp as steel. "Where is his lawyer? What is he even being charged with?" Her words weren't a question. They were a demand. Zion had seen his mother mad before. But never like this. Kincaid stepped forward, arms crossed, his badge gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. "We have surveillance footage that places him near the crime scene," he said smoothly, like this was just another day, just another case. A store was broken into. Stolen tools. Property damage. He fits the suspect's description. Lorraine's nostrils flared. "And that description is what exactly?" she shot back. Kincaid didn't blink. Dark hoodie. Sneakers. Young. Black. Silence. Zion watched as his mother's jaw tightened, her fists clenching at her sides. He could see the anger in her, feel the way she was holding it back. She took a slow, deep breath, her chest rising and falling. She knew. She knew exactly what was happening here. "My son," she said, enunciating every word, "was walking to school." Kincaid shrugged. "That's what you say." For a second, Zion thought his mother was going to lunge at him. Instead, she did something scarier. She went still. Her voice, when she spoke again, was low, controlled, deadly. "Get me his lawyer." The officers exchanged glances. Then finally, one of them sighed and stepped out of the room. Minutes later, a man in a wrinkled suit walked in, flipping through a file like he had just picked it up outside the door. Zion didn't need to hear a word to know what kind of lawyer he was. Public defender. Overworked. Underpaid. Uninterested. He barely glanced at Zion as he dropped into the chair across from them. "They're offering a plea deal," he said, rubbing his temples like this was just another headache to get through. Lorraine's head snapped toward him. "A what?" The lawyer let out a long, tired sigh. "If he pleads guilty, he avoids trial. No jail time. Just probation and community service. It's the best option." Zion felt the floor drop out from under him. Guilty. They wanted him to say he did it. Even though he didn't. Even though he had done nothing wrong. His mother didn't even hesitate. "We're not signing anything." The lawyer exhaled heavily, like he had heard this 100 times before. "I understand, Miss Whitaker, but you need to know how these cases go." Zion didn't like the way he said that. The lawyer leaned forward, speaking quieter now, like he was trying to reason with her. "It's his word against a police officer's," he said. "And trials don't usually go well in situations like this." Lorraine cut him off. "Then we'll find someone who actually gives a damn about this case." The lawyer looked annoyed now, flipping the file shut. "Look, I get it. But you have to understand, if this goes to trial, you're taking a risk. If he loses, he could end up with a record. That could follow him for life." Zion barely heard him. He wasn't listening anymore. Because for the first time in his life, he realized something terrifying. No one in this room cared whether he was innocent or not. Not Kincaid. Not this lawyer. Not the system. They had already decided he was guilty. Zion looked down at his hands, still cuffed, and something inside him hardened. He wasn't going to let them decide his future for him. If no one else was going to fight for him, he would fight for himself. Zion lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, the glow of the streetlights outside casting faint shadows across his room. The air felt too thick, too heavy, pressing against his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, the same images played over and over in his mind. Kincaid's smirk. The cold press of the handcuffs. The lawyer's tired voice pushing the plea deal. He kept thinking about that moment in the police station, the way no one had really listened. Not Kincaid, not the public defender, not even the officer who had typed his name into the system like it was just another Tuesday. They had already decided who he was. It didn't matter that he had never been in trouble before. It didn't matter that he had been walking to school, not robbing a store. None of it mattered. They had already made up their minds. Zion clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. If no one else was going to fight for him, he'd fight for himself. The next day, when the lunch bell rang, Zion didn't follow the crowd to the cafeteria. His stomach was tight, twisted with something that had nothing to do with hunger. He headed straight for the library instead, pushing through the heavy wooden doors into the quiet space beyond. Most kids didn't come here during lunch. The silence was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of pages turning. Zion walked past rows of bookshelves until he reached the legal section. It wasn't big, just a few shelves filled with dusty textbooks and reference materials. But right now, it was all he had. He ran his fingers along the spines, pulling out a thick book titled Criminal Procedure. He flipped through the pages, scanning the bolded terms and summaries, searching for anything that could help him understand what had happened to him. Burden of proof. The prosecution had to prove he was guilty. It wasn't his job to prove he was innocent. Chain of evidence. If the police didn't handle evidence properly, it could be thrown out. Witness credibility. A cop's word carried weight, but if there were inconsistencies, their testimony could fall apart. Zion's breath came faster. This was it. This was something. He flipped another page, scanning the text. Height discrepancies in eyewitness accounts. Something clicked in his head. The suspect in the footage, the one Kincaid had claimed was him. Had anyone actually checked how tall they were? Zion wasn't exactly tall for his age. 5'4" on a good day. But what if the person in the video was taller? His fingers tightened around the book. If he could prove that the person in the footage wasn't him, this whole case could fall apart. A voice made him jump. "You in trouble, kid?" Zion looked up. Mr. Langford, the school librarian, stood a few feet away, adjusting the thick glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. He was an older man, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of piercing gaze that made it hard to lie. Zion hesitated. He could make something up, say it was for a project. But Langford wasn't the kind of guy you fooled easily. So he sighed. Yeah. Langford didn't ask for details. Instead, he pulled out the chair across from Zion and sat down. "Then you'd better know what you're doing." Zion blinked. Langford tapped a finger on the open page in front of him. The law's a tricky thing. It's not just about being right. It's about proving it in a way that makes people listen. Zion nodded slowly, gripping his pen a little tighter. For the next hour, they went through everything. Langford helped him break down courtroom strategy, how to make a jury see the truth, how to plant reasonable doubt, how to ask the right questions. By the time Zion left the library, his notebook was full of notes. His mind was racing. He wasn't just hoping for justice anymore. He was preparing for battle. The courtroom smelled like old wood and stale coffee, the air thick with anticipation. Zion sat at the defendant's table, hands clasped together, his heartbeat steady but strong. His public defender sat beside him, flipping through notes without much enthusiasm, as if he were reading the case for the first time. Across the room, Sergeant Roy Kincaid sat stiffly in his uniform, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But Zion could see it, the quiet confidence, the certainty that he had already won. The judge, an older man with silver hair and deep lines across his face, settled into his seat. He gave the prosecution a nod. Proceed. The prosecutor, a woman in a crisp navy blue suit, rose to her feet. She didn't waste time. Your Honor, this case is simple, she said, turning toward the jury. The defendant was seen near the crime scene. He matched the description given in the footage. Sergeant Kincaid, a decorated officer with over 20 years of experience, detained him based on probable cause. We believe the case speaks for itself. She turned, walking toward the jury with slow, deliberate steps. The store was broken into. Stolen goods were taken. And who was seen nearby? The defendant. She gestured toward Zion. The hoodie. The sneakers. The timing. It all adds up. It sounded so clean, so obvious. Zion clenched his fists under the table. Then, his lawyer stood. He muttered, clearing his throat. My client maintains his innocence. We, intend to show that the evidence does not conclusively prove that he committed this crime. That was it. That was his entire defense. Zion closed his eyes for half a second, forcing down the frustration. He had prepared for this. He wasn't going to just sit there and watch himself be thrown under the bus. The judge glanced at him. Mr. Whitaker, I understand you wish to speak on your own behalf. Zion took a deep breath. He felt his mother's presence in the back row, holding her breath. He stood. Yes, Your Honor. His voice was steady. Ido. The judge studied him for a moment, then nodded. Proceed. Zion took a step forward, facing the jury directly. Let's talk about the evidence, he said. Or the lack of it. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. He turned to the prosecution. You said I was caught on security footage, right? The prosecutor nodded. Yes, we were just about to present it. She gestured toward the screen. The footage began to play. A grainy figure in a hoodie, moving fast. The store's window already shattered. The person's face completely hidden. Zion folded his arms. That's it. The prosecutor frowned. That is you. Zion shook his head. No. It's not. Silence. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, may I ask a question? The judge raised an eyebrow. You may. Zion turned to Sergeant Kincaid. Officer, he said, keeping his voice calm. How tall am I? Kincaid blinked, caught off guard. I don't know. 5'4". Zion nodded, then pointed at the screen. Then tell me why the store's security camera logs say the suspect is 5'9". The room went still. The jury shifted. The prosecutor hesitated. Kincaid's jaw tightened. Zion let the silence stretch for just a moment before continuing. Officer, did you check my shoes when you arrested me? Kincaid straightened in his seat. Of course. Zion nodded. And were they the same shoes the suspect was wearing? Kincaid hesitated. Just for a second. But everyone saw it. Zion turned back to the jury. With all due respect, that's not how evidence works. The prosecutor quickly cleared her throat. Even if the height isn't exact, the hoodie and sneakers still match. That places you at the scene. Zion didn't flinch. Actually, he said, that's not how the law works either. He turned back to Kincaid. Officer, would you say you believed I was guilty when you arrested me? Kincaid narrowed his eyes. I had probable cause. But did you have proof? Kincaid shifted. Zion stepped forward, his voice stronger now. You didn't find stolen goods on me. You didn't find my fingerprints at the scene. You didn't even check the height of the suspect before arresting me. Kincaid's fingers tapped against the armrest of his chair. Zion turned back to the jury. The law says you have to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And right now, there's doubt all over this case. The judge turned to the prosecution. Do you have any direct evidence linking the defendant to the crime? The prosecutor hesitated. The officer believed, but Zion had already torn that belief apart. And then the final blow. Zion pulled a folded paper from his pocket and walked toward the judge's bench. Your Honor, I'd like to submit something to the court. The prosecutor's eyes snapped up. The judge raised an eyebrow. And what is that? Zion handed over the document. A record of Sergeant Kincaid's disciplinary history. A ripple of shock spread through the courtroom. The judge flipped through the pages. His face hardened. Sergeant Kincaid, he said slowly. Is it true that you've had multiple complaints filed against you for wrongful arrests? Kincaid's jaw tightened. His fingers twitched. That's irrelevant, the prosecutor cut in. Zion turned to the jury. Is it? He asked. Because I think it matters. He let his words settle. I think it matters that the officer accusing me of a crime has been caught doing this before. Silence. For the first time since this nightmare began, Zion felt it. The shift. The doubt. The judge exhaled. He turned to the prosecutor. After reviewing the evidence and the new information presented, I am instructing the district attorney's office to open an internal investigation into Sergeant Kincaid's conduct. A ripple of shock spread through the room. Kincaid's face turned red. Your Honor, this is absurd. I'd be very careful about what you say next, officer, the judge interrupted, his voice firm. Because this court has seen enough today to question whether you should be wearing that badge at all. Silence. Zion sat down, breathing carefully. His mother reached forward from the row behind him, squeezing his shoulder. You were brilliant, she whispered. But he wasn't celebrating yet. Because the biggest revelation was still coming. The courtroom was silent. The kind of silence that felt thick, heavy, pressing down on every person in the room. Zion sat at the defendant's table, his fingers gripping the edge of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His mother sat just behind him, hands clasped together, lips moving in a silent prayer. At the front of the courtroom, the jury filed back into their seats, their expressions unreadable. The foreman, an older man with a serious face, stood. He held a folded sheet of paper, the verdict. Zion's heartbeat thundered in his ears. The judge nodded toward the foreman. Has the jury reached a verdict? Yes, Your Honor. Zion could feel his mother's hand on his shoulder, a silent reassurance, but he barely noticed. His whole world had narrowed to this moment. The foreman unfolded the paper. He cleared his throat. On the charge of burglary, we find the defendant, Zion Whitaker, not guilty. For a moment, Zion fällt nothing. Then, everything at once. A sharp exhale from his mother, a rush of relief so strong it made him lightheaded. His chest loosened, his breath coming easier. He turned slightly, saw Lorraine press a hand over her heart, her eyes closed, her lips trembling. She had fought for him. She had never stopped fighting for him. And now, it was over. Except it wasn't. Not yet. The judge cleared his throat, shifting in his seat as he turned toward the prosecution. His eyes hardened. After reviewing the evidence and the new information presented, he said, his voice firm, I am instructing the district attorney's office to open an internal investigation into Sergeant Kincaid's conduct. A ripple of shock swept through the courtroom. Kincaid's face went red, his fingers twitching where they rested on the table. His jaw clenched so tightly Zion thought he might break his own teeth. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the judge cut him off. I'd be very careful about what you say next, officer, the judge warned, his voice carrying a weight that made the entire courtroom feel smaller. Kincaid stiffened. The judge continued. This court has seen enough today to question whether you should be wearing that badge at all. For the first time since this nightmare began, Kincaid looked powerless. Zion watched as the officer shifted uncomfortably, His confidence cracked, then shattered. He wasn't the one in handcuffs, but in that moment, he may as well have been. The trial is adjourned. The gavel slammed down, the sharp crack echoing through the room. It was over. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different. Lighter. Bigger. Zion had walked into that building as a defendant. Now, he was walking out free. But freedom felt different when you had to fight for it. Reporters swarmed near the courthouse steps, cameras flashing, microphones being thrust forward. A journalist pushed through the crowd, calling out, "Zion, how does it feel to prove your innocence?" Zion paused. His mother's hand rested on his shoulder, grounding him, steadying him. He could have said a lot of things. That he felt relieved. That he felt angry. That he felt tired. Instead, he looked straight into the cameras, voice calm, steady. "I shouldn't have had to." Silence. Tin murmurs. People scribbling in notepads, typing into phones. The weight of those words settled, because that was the truth. Zion hadn't just fought against a wrongful accusation. He had fought against a system that wasn't built for him to win. And that system was still standing. Days passed. Then a week. The internal investigation into Kincaid's conduct became public. More stories surfaced. More names. Other kids. Other cases. Other lives ruined. Some had taken plea deals just to make it stop. Others had lost years of their lives. Zion had won his case, but the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. One afternoon, he walked back into the school library, a notebook tucked under his arm. Mr. Langford, the librarian, looked up from his desk, adjusting his glasses. "What's that?" he asked.
Zion sets a notebook down.
"A list." Langford raised an eyebrow. "Of what?"
Zion exhaled, running a hand over the cover of the notebook.
"Every law I've been reading. Every right people need to know. Every trick they use to keep people quiet." He pushed the notebook forward. "I want to help people.
Kids like me.
So this never happens again." Langford studied him for a long moment. Then, he smiled. "Then you'd better get to work." Zion's fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. If this story made you think, don't just scroll away. Take action. Like this video to help spread awareness. Share it with your friends and family, because conversations spark change.
Comment below and tell us your two cooks.
Have you ever witnessed an abuse of power?
Let's talk about it.
Follow our channel for more powerful real-life stories. And turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Change starts with awareness. Awareness starts with you. Be part of the movement.